Hello, hey everybody. Joey Sparks here. God's mercies are new again this morning.
This morning with my mind stayed on Jesus. I woke up this morning with my mind.
Revelation chapter 20 contains a detail that's so often discussed and abused. 1,000 years, the 1,000-year reign. What this detail will do is help us to really assess, honestly, our interpretation habits when it comes to this book. It'll challenge us to handle this book appropriately. Will we rightly divide the word of truth when it comes to this book? The problem with the common, popular interpretation of the 1,000 years is that it drops down into this book and it takes a lot of these details that are clearly figurative and it keeps them figurative. It makes them be figurative. And then it takes this one detail, 1,000 years and a 1,000-year reign, and it makes it literal. So that's a problem. At the outset, that's a problem. Also, if you abide by consistent, clear rules of interpretation throughout the book, there's no way you can get to that timeline of events that we keep hearing about and keep setting up and resetting up and having to change if it's going to depict, quote, the end of time as we know it. It's a cycle that's intended to show us the complete judgment of God. It's an intense cycle. And the point is all about God's judgment against God's enemies. Chapter 18, it's the enemy of Rome and its false prophets that force Christians to worship the emperor or die, worship the emperor or suffer mightily. You see judgment cast against them in chapter 18. Chapter 20 is now the judgment against the dragon that gives those beasts that power. So that's the overall point. Don't start with chapter 20 as another powerful interpretation tool. Start at least in chapter 19. It's verse 11. You see Jesus entering the picture on the white horse. He's coming to give his final judgment once and for all. Well, you also see Jesus takes the beast and the false prophet, verse 20 of chapter 19, and he casts them into the lake of fire. And so you see them once and for all cast into eternal judgment. Well, you saw Rome falling in chapter 18. Now you see the beast again referenced and being thrown into the fire. That's a reminder to be careful about time in Revelation. Don't force a literal timeline. You see judgment coming against Rome multiple times in this cycle. So let's be careful not to assume everything is a literal timeline. Well, that becomes important when you take a symbol, the symbol of 1,000 years. You can't necessarily force it to be all about time. 42 months was not a literal 42 months. It was a symbol for partial, for half. Well, now we get to interpret another principle, another symbol, about time. Now, what's going on here? Well, you see Jesus and this angel coordinating this judgment against Satan. And all it's intended to do was to show us how thoroughly Satan has already been defeated. Okay? That's the opening verses, of chapter 20. And then you see the final defeat of Satan for eternity, beginning in chapter 7. Chapter 20, verse 7 through verse 10. Okay? So let's talk about 1,000 years. Two ways to go with that. I'll tell you which one I kind of lean toward, but two ways work without changing the meaning of the book at all. Number one, if you take it to be time, it's referring to time. It's not a literal 1,000 years, but it is a time period, an era, an epoch, if you will. Then we would be living in the time of the 1,000 years. That right now, Jesus already reigns. He has those martyrs beside him, and we know he is king and he reigns completely and thoroughly. And we're waiting for a generic period of time to conclude, not a literal 1,000 years. That's possible. Second option is that it's not even time at all. Here's one reason to consider that. In the Greek text, there is no for. There is no for, the preposition for, indicating duration. It's just 1,000 years. That's all it is in the Greek text. So, verse number 2, bound him 1,000 years. You can hear it. Bound him, if you take that as more of an adverb instead of duration, he bound him thoroughly, completely, perfectly, in a way that cannot be unbound until 1,000 years were ended. Verse number 6, those who reign with Jesus, they will reign with him 1,000 years, completely. I think there's some merit to that idea of thinking. Even if you choose to think of it as an era of time, a dispensation of time, it's a complete dispensation of time. Jesus' victory over Satan is already complete. And all we're doing is living until his final judgment will be rendered for all of eternity. And you see that beginning in verse 7. So don't let it spook you. Don't let it paralyze us when others falsely describe this as a literal time. But instead, anticipate God's final judgment over our enemy Satan once and for all. And we thank him for that complete victory over him that he's already secured through the cross and his resurrection. I would point you to Revelation chapter 12, compare it to chapter 20, but also John chapter 12, where Jesus says he'll cast out the ruler of this age when he is lifted up. The cross, the resurrection, is when Jesus has already once and defeated Satan. Hey, thank you for your time this morning. It's our prayer. God's timeless word will be on your mind all day today.
I woke up this morning.